It's been a little while since I uploaded on this channel, but today I want to show you guys how I set up my camera specifically for making YouTube videos. So if you want to hit pause really quick, go grab your camera, you can follow along with me and set up your camera exactly the way that I do mine. Alright, so most of the settings that I'm going to show you on here apply to any camera, whether you're shooting with Canon, Sony, Fujifilm, Nikon. It's all going to be kind of the same concepts. There are going to be a couple of Canon specific things that I show you, but most of the stuff is going to apply to any camera. I just want to preface this video by saying that I don't proclaim to be a filmmaker. A lot of people on YouTube throw that term around. Most of my training with cameras is like self-taught, but I do make a full-time income through my other YouTube channel, so take this advice for what it's worth. So first off, let's start with the frame rate. I shoot all of my videos at 24 frames per second. That's kind of like an industry standard frame rate that you'll see in a lot of big production, like Hollywood movies, documentaries are shot like that. So that frame rate tends to look the most natural to my eyes. Now occasionally, if there's a shot that I know that I'm gonna slow down, like say a skateboard trick or like a cinematic car wash sequence, I will temporarily switch the camera into either 60 frames per second or 120 frames per second so that I can film those in slow motion, but then I will immediately switch back to 24 before I continue filming. So that's the first thing, 24 frames per second for the frame rate. Now once we've got the frame rate established, the shutter speed is actually really easy because it's just double whatever the frame rate is. So for example, we're shooting at 24 frames per second. That means that our shutter is going to be 1/50th of a second. Technically 1/48th, but most of these style photo cameras, they only have the 1/50th option, which is close enough. Now of course, if you're going to be doing slow motion at 60 frames per second, you would just double that and you would get 1/120th of a second for your shutter speed. So for the aperture, I shoot all of my videos on the Canon 24-105 f4, and for the most part I'm keeping the lens at around f4 to let the most light in as possible. Now there are occasions where, let's say I'm doing a DIY and I actually need to show more detail in the shot, I actually want more depth of field. Sometimes I'll stop the lens down to, let's say, f8 just so that I can get more of the scene in focus, but for the most part I'm keeping the lens at around f4. So as far as exposure goes, that leaves ISO as the main way that I adjust the exposure of my camera. Basically, as a general rule, you want to keep that number as low as possible for the scene that you're shooting. The higher that you go in the ISO numbers, the more noise or grain you're going to introduce into your shot. So whatever I'm shooting, I try to keep the ISO as low as I can. One quick tip here is don't be afraid to use auto ISO, especially if you're vlogging, you know, walking from outdoors in the daylight to inside of a building. Sometimes if you have your camera in auto, it'll actually adjust much more quick and seamlessly than you'd be able to do on your own. So don't be afraid to use some of the auto settings on your camera. I know a lot of people will say that that's not professional, but as a YouTuber, the auto stuff, it does come in handy sometimes. For autofocus, I pretty much have the autofocus switch on all the time. I almost never turn it off, and there's two modes that I use. If I'm going to be filming myself the way that I am right now, where my face is in the shot, I use the face tracking. It's got like a little picture of a face, a little icon, and that will lock onto your face. Canon cameras do this really well. Sony is another one that has really good facial tracking, but that's the mode that I use the most often. And then if I'm filming something else where my face isn't in the shot, I'll use single point. And then like on the EOS R, you can just kind of move your thumb around the screen and that will change where the camera's focusing. So again, if I'm shooting myself, I'm using the face tracking. If I'm shooting my car or shooting a DIY where I'm not in front of the camera, I'll use the single point and I'll just tap on the screen where I want the camera to focus. So the next thing is white balance, and this one's pretty simple too because it's gonna look the most obvious if you don't have it right. And luckily the camera gives you pictures of what the light looks like. So, you know, if you're out in sunlight, it's gonna have a little picture of a sun. If it's cloudy, there's a picture of clouds, so it's really hard to mess that one up. Another tip that I'm going to give you with white balance is, again, don't be afraid to use auto white balance. That will save you sometimes. For example, in my garage, the lights that I have up on the ceiling don't quite match my big dome light. The light is a little bit different color, and what I find is sometimes the auto white balance actually does a better job than if I try to like manually adjust the Kelvin temperature. So again, don't be afraid of using some of these auto settings. As a YouTuber, I find them to be super helpful, and modern cameras like these, they've come a really long way with the auto just getting it right. So next we have the picture profile, and I know that this is going to be controversial because I actually use the faithful profile, which gives you like the most true to life, you know, what your eye would see is what the camera captures, and it just saves me a bunch of time from having to color grade the footage. A lot of big YouTube channels will tell you like shoot in a log profile or shoot in like a really flat neutral profile that we can like add adjustment layers and lumetri color and add LUTs and all that stuff. And I used to do all that stuff back when I had the A6500, but to be honest with you, as a YouTuber, I just found it to be a big waste of time. I would rather just get the colors and everything right in the camera, and it just eliminates an entire step out of my editing process. And it allows me to focus on other things that are more important, like reaching out to sponsors, working on my Instagram, and other things like that that are more beneficial for my time than messing around with like the color grading and that sort of thing. Now again, if you're a filmmaker and you're making like a short film or a documentary, then yeah, go ahead and shoot in log, and that's going to give you like the absolute best picture profile or the best picture quality possible. But for me, what I've learned is that speed is the name of the game, and any steps that I can eliminate from my process, the better. That's why I shoot in Faithful. Now I do turn down the sharpening. I find that adding sharpening in Premiere looks a little bit better than letting the camera do it, but other than that, I'm just using the Faithful profile just as the camera came out of the box. As far as stabilization, I almost always leave this switched on the lens, unless I'm doing a sit down video like this where the camera's on the tripod the whole time, where you don't really need it. The stabilizer does use a little bit more battery life, and depending on what lens you're using, sometimes the stabilizer can make some weird noises, but for the most part, I almost always leave this turned on. Now this camera, the EOS R, doesn't have any in-body sensor stabilization, but it does have software stabilization where it kind of crops in on the image a little bit. It's kind of like warp stabilizer in Premiere, but built into the camera. I don't really use that. I don't like that it crops in on the video. I would rather let Premiere do that in post. But as far as the lens, I leave the stabilization turned on unless I'm on a tripod. Now as far as the audio levels, I've always just kept them in auto, and I find that it works really well. Again, as a YouTuber, anything that I can let the camera handle for me, I'm gonna do it. And for me, the auto audio levels, they just work, and I've never had an issue with that. For resolution, I shoot all of my videos in 1080p using the all-eye option. So on Canon cameras, all-eye is like the high bitrate. It's gonna give you the absolute highest quality possible 1080p. Now I could go into a whole rant video on why you don't need 4K. I used to have a Sony A6500, and for 2 years I uploaded 4K videos, but for me, I found it to be a waste of my time. It's like a lot of extra time editing, a lot of extra time uploading and processing the video. And looking at the analytics, like most of my viewers are watching on mobile devices. So for all the extra work that you're doing, like most of your viewers, they're not even gonna see the benefit of 4K, at least not right now. So I just wanna reiterate, I do make a full-time income through my other channel, shooting in 1080p. So if anyone wants to argue that you need 4K, I'm telling you, you don't need it. 1080 is just fine. So for the export settings, I have these actually written down on my phone here. So I use the H.264, and when you scroll down, there's an option for YouTube 2K. Even though I shoot the videos in 1080, I actually export them in 2K, and the reason for that is because with YouTube, when you're uploading in 2K or 4K, it actually renders at a much higher bitrate than if you were to just upload a 1080p video, and you can see a really big visual difference. So that's a little cheat for you guys if you have a camera that only shoots in 1080. If you export the video in 4K, it's actually going to look quite a lot nicer than if you just upload the 1080p. So alright, so I hope you guys got something out of this. The reason that I wanted to make this video is there's so many channels to kind of show you how to set up your camera as a filmmaker. It's just kind of like a general term to cover anything that involves shooting with the camera, but I wanted to show you some specific things as a YouTuber that I use to make my life easier, to take steps out of my editing process, and just make everything faster and more streamlined. So leave a comment down below. I'm interested to hear what camera you guys are shooting with, and I'll see you guys in the next video.